9 Golden Age stars who became homeless. The lights of Hollywood have always burned with blinding intensity, illuminating those lucky enough to stand in their glow. But when those lights turn away, the darkness that follows can be absolute. Behind the glamorous facade of Hollywood's golden age lies a disturbing pattern. Stars who once commanded thousands per week, whose faces graced magazine covers worldwide, who lived in mansions and signed autographs for adoring fans, reduced to sleeping on park benches, in abandoned buildings, or dying alone in squalid apartments. The entertainment industry creates a particularly devastating form of fall, explained a veteran social worker who has helped numerous former entertainers facing homelessness. These people don't just lose careers, they lose identities. When you've been treated like royalty and suddenly find yourself invisible, the psychological impact is as devastating as the financial one. What makes these stories especially haunting is the extreme contrast between their professional peaks and personal naders. The same faces that once launched 1,000 movie magazines eventually went unrecognized on the very streets where their stars had once been embedded in the Walk of Fame. Hollywood has always operated on a brutal form of planned obsolescence, noted a film historian who has tracked the fates of forgotten stars. The system is designed to extract everything marketable from talent during peak years, with almost no concern for what happens when that marketability fades. It's been this way since the silent era, and despite all our supposed progress, similar stories continue emerging today. Perhaps most disturbing is how quickly this transformation can occur. The journey from million-dollar contracts to homelessness, sometimes taking just a few years. Child stars seem particularly vulnerable, having earned fortunes before developing the maturity to manage them, then finding themselves discarded when they outgrow their marketable innocence. There's something uniquely American about these tragedies, observed a cultural anthropologist who studies celebrity. They represent the darkest version of the American dream, the promise that anyone can rise to the heights of fame and fortune, coupled with the harsh reality that those heights are often temporary, and the fall can be fatal. Today, we're exploring 9 of the most heartbreaking stories of Golden Age stars who experienced homelessness or extreme poverty after once commanding the heights of fame. From the child star who went from Disney's Golden Boy to dying unidentified in an abandoned building, to the silent film beauty whose emaciated body was discovered only after her starving dog began consuming her remains. Behind these shocking headlines lie deeply human stories about the entertainment industry's darkest failures, and important warnings about the true cost of fame's fleeting embrace. But first, we begin with perhaps the most devastating example of Hollywood's capacity to elevate and then abandon its youngest talents, the boy who gave voice to Peter Pan before discovering that, unlike his character, he could indeed grow old, but couldn't find a home when he did.
Thank you very much. Sorry Francis couldn't be with me tonight. But he's home making out his speech for next year.
Bobby Driscoll, from Disney's Golden Boy to John Doe. When Walt Disney needed a child star to build his early live-action films around, he chose Bobby Driscoll. With his expressive eyes and natural performance style, Driscoll became Disney's first contract child actor and the face of the studio's family-friendly image throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Child star of Treasure Island and the voice of Disney's Peter Pan, noted a film historian specializing in Disney's early live-action productions. Driscoll wasn't just a performer for the studio, he was a marketing cornerstone. Walt showcased him as the embodiment of the wholesome American boy, the kind of child every parent wished they had. Driscoll's contributions to Disney included not just his performances in films like Song of the South and So Dear to My Heart, but also providing both the voice and physical model for animation in Peter Pan, ironically playing a character famous for never growing up. But grow up he did, and that's when Disney's support evaporated with stunning speed. Dropped by Disney as he aged, explained the historian. When adolescence hit and his adorable child star looks began changing, the studio simply terminated his contract. There was no transition plan, no guidance for continuing his career, no financial management assistance for the money he'd earned. One day, he was Disney's Golden Boy. The next, he was just another teenager looking for work. This abrupt abandonment created a psychological wound that never healed. Driscoll, unprepared for rejection after years of adulation, found himself struggling in a conventional high school where his former celebrity made him a target rather than a hero. The contrast between being treated like royalty one day and being bullied the next created a psychological whiplash, observed a child psychologist who has worked with former child actors. Add in the typical identity questions of adolescence, and you have a perfect storm for significant emotional damage. By his late teens, Driscoll was experimenting with drugs to cope with depression and feelings of worthlessness. His attempts to continue acting met with limited success. The cute child star had become an ordinary-looking young man, and the industry that had once celebrated him, now barely recognized him, fell into heroin addiction, was found dead in an abandoned building in 1968, said the historian. The speed of his decline was breathtaking. By his early 20s, he was already heavily addicted. By 31, he was dead, found by children playing in an abandoned tenement in New York's East Village. The final indignity came after death. With no identification on his body and his appearance transformed by years of hard living, Driscoll wasn't immediately recognized. His remains were buried in an unmarked pauper's grave on Hart Island, New York City's Potter's Field. Buried in a pauper's grave, identity unknown for over a year, noted the historian. His mother had reported him missing, but there was no connection made between her handsome son and the John Doe found in that abandoned building. Only when fingerprint records were cross-referenced months later was his identity established, but his body remained in its anonymous grave. The cruel irony of Driscoll's fate, that the boy who played Peter Pan, the character who never grew up, would die so young yet so aged by hard living, has made his story one of Hollywood's most potent cautionary tales. He was Disney's golden boy, then he died alone, broke, and forgotten, summarized a documentary filmmaker who researched Driscoll's life. The contrast between the cherubic child in those classic Disney films and the emaciated addict who died without even a name represents everything wrong with how Hollywood treats its young talent. In 2019, Driscoll's story gained renewed attention when Macaulay Culkin, another child star who navigated the perilous transition to adulthood, referenced him in an interview. "Bobby Driscoll's my boy. No one talks about him. Poor little guy." While Driscoll's story represents the particular vulnerabilities of child stars in the studio system, our next subject demonstrates how even adult performers with significant critical acclaim could find themselves abandoned by the industry that once celebrated them.
We're all young one time. But anyway, do you attribute that to John Huston's direction? Did he pull something out of you that wasn't there or that you didn't know existed?
You're asking, this is a touchy subject, you know.
No, I don't know. I hear it's a touchy subject.
You know, it was in spite of him. I was acting in spite of him. It was another thing, I'll show you.
Susan Tyrrell, from Oscar nomination to destitution. In 1972, Susan Tyrrell received an Academy Award nomination for her raw, uncompromising performance as a barfly in John Huston's Fat City. Critics hailed her as one of the most fearless character actresses of her generation, willing to embrace roles other performers might avoid due to their unglamorous or disturbing qualities. This critical recognition should have launched a sustained career of significant roles. Instead, it marked the beginning of a slow descent into poverty and health crises that would eventually leave her living in desperate circumstances. Oscar-nominated character actress Fat City, noted a casting director who worked with Tyrrell in the 1970s. Susan wasn't just talented, she was uniquely talented. She could play characters no one else would touch, bringing humanity to roles that might have been caricatures in lesser hands, but that very uniqueness made her difficult to cast in conventional projects. Tyrrell's unconventional appearance and refusal to conform to Hollywood's expectations for actresses gradually reduced her opportunities. Though she continued working throughout the 1970s and 80s, the roles became smaller, the projects less prestigious, and the pay increasingly inadequate. By the 1990s, financial difficulties had forced her into increasingly modest living situations. Then, in 2000, a devastating health crisis struck. She was diagnosed with essential thrombocythemia, a rare blood disease that eventually necessitated the amputation of both her legs. Lost her legs to illness, lived her final years in a tiny apartment with no AC or heat, revealed a friend who visited Tyrrell in her later years. She was living in a converted trailer in Venice, California, one room essentially, with inadequate climate control. In Southern California summers, it was like an oven. In winter, she shivered under blankets. This was an Academy Award nominee, reduced to living in conditions most people wouldn't accept for their pets. Despite these devastating circumstances, Tyrrell maintained the fierce independence and dark humor that had characterized her performances. She painted surreal artworks from her wheelchair, gave profanity-laden interviews when journalists occasionally remembered her existence, and refused to portray herself as a victim despite her objective victimization by both illness and industry abandonment. Described her life as part art, part madness, all survival, said her friend. She had this extraordinary capacity to transform suffering into creative expression, but that doesn't make what happened to her any less tragic. The system used her unique qualities when they were marketable, then discarded her when her health challenges made her less commercially viable. Tyrrell died in 2012 at age 67, largely forgotten by the industry that had once nominated her for its highest honor. No tribute was paid at the Oscar ceremony the following year, despite her status as a former nominee. Hollywood gave her trophies, then left her with nothing, observed a film critic who championed Tyrrell's work throughout her career. Her story reveals the hollow nature of industry recognition. An Oscar nomination might appear to guarantee a certain level of professional respect and financial security, but the reality is far harsher, particularly for character actresses who don't fit conventional beauty standards. While Tyrrell's destitution came decades after her career peak, our next subject experienced a much more rapid descent, from silent film stardom to a death so lonely and degrading it created tabloid headlines that overshadowed her considerable artistic legacy. Marie Prévost, the silent star's silenced end. In the 1920s, Marie Prévost embodied the spirit of the flapper era. With her vivacious presence and modern sensibility, she starred in dozens of successful silent films, commanding top salaries and living the glamorous lifestyle her fans imagined for their favorite stars. Her swift fall from this pinnacle to desperate poverty and a gruesome, lonely death represents one of Hollywood's most shocking cautionary tales. Silent film siren, starred in dozens of pictures, noted a film historian specializing in women's roles during the silent era. Prévost wasn't just a pretty face, she was a genuinely talented comedienne who worked with major directors like Ernst Lubitsch. At her peak, she was making $1,500 a week, equivalent to about $25,000 weekly in today's money. Two factors contributed to Prévost's career decline: the transition to talking pictures, which proved challenging for many silent stars, and a series of personal tragedies that led to depression and alcoholism. The death of her mother in a car accident particularly affected her, initiating a period of emotional struggle that manifested in increased drinking. As her career opportunities diminished, Prévost's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. The high-living star who had once owned multiple properties found herself living in increasingly modest circumstances as the 1930s progressed. Drank heavily after her career collapsed, explained the historian. Like many performers who experience early success, she hadn't prepared financially for career challenges. When the roles dried up, her savings quickly followed. By the mid-1930s, she was living in a rundown apartment, desperately trying to secure even bit parts to pay her rent. Prévost's final days were spent in isolation and poverty. On January 21, 1937, neighbors complained about persistent barking coming from her apartment. When authorities entered, they discovered Prévost had died days earlier from acute alcoholism combined with malnutrition. She was 38 years old. What transformed this already tragic story into tabloid sensation was the discovery that her small dog, trapped in the apartment with her body and starving, had begun biting her remains in a desperate attempt to awaken her or obtain food. Died in 1937, alone in a rundown apartment. Her body wasn't found for days, said the historian. The press focused ghoulishly on the dog aspect, creating lurid headlines that overshadowed any discussion of how a major star could have been so completely abandoned by the industry and former colleagues that her death went unnoticed for so long. The contrast between Prévost's peak fame and her squalid end could hardly be more stark. Photos from her stardom show a vibrant, fashionable woman surrounded by luxury and admiration. Her death photos, which tabloids shamefully published, showed an emaciated body in a barren apartment with little more than a bed and chair. She was once the face of the Roaring Twenties, then died penniless and eaten by her dog, observed the historian. The sensationalistic coverage of her death says everything about how the entertainment industry and media treat fallen stars. as cautionary spectacles rather than human beings deserving of dignity. Prevost's death resulted in one positive development. It contributed to the formation of the Motion Picture and Television Fund, established to provide financial assistance to industry workers facing hardship. This organization continues helping entertainment professionals today, preventing at least some former performers from experiencing fates similar to Prevost's. While Prevost's story represents the brutal transition from silent to sound films, our next subject demonstrates how even established international stars could find themselves living in obscurity and financial insecurity when their marketability faded.
How did she get there?
Oh, you're brilliant, Earthly. How did you guess it was a she?
Oh, well, so many of them lately are.
Exactly, and I might be suspected of all those murders. What do you suppose I ought to do about it?
Arthur!
For one thing, speak a little softer.
Neighbor, I'm going to ask you to help me to show a little neighborliness.
Turhan Bey, the Turkish delight who vanished. With his exotic good looks and smooth accented voice, Austrian-born actor Turhan Bey became known as the Turkish delight during the 1940s. Specializing in roles that capitalized on his Middle Eastern appearance, Bey appeared in numerous adventure films and romantic dramas, often playing mysterious foreigners, charming villains, or exotic princes. At his peak, he was dating starlets like Lana Turner and appearing in major studio productions. But when audience tastes changed in the post-war era, Bey didn't just experience career decline, he seemingly vanished from existence. Matinee idol of the 1940s, explained a film historian who tracked Bey's unusual career arc. During World War II, Hollywood needed new male stars while established actors were serving in the military. Bey's exotic look filled a particular niche in adventure films and romances. But when the war ended and conventional leading men returned to Hollywood, his opportunities rapidly diminished. Recognizing the shifting landscape, Bey made a decision unusual for the era. He chose to leave Hollywood voluntarily in 1953, returning to his native Vienna. What he didn't anticipate was how completely this departure would erase his former life and livelihood. After his career dried up, he disappeared for decades, noted the historian. Unlike stars who struggled publicly with their reduced circumstances, Bey simply vanished from public consciousness. For nearly 40 years, he lived in near-complete obscurity in Vienna, his previous fame seemingly erased from collective memory. This disappearance was so complete that many film references listed him as deceased decades before his actual death. The reality of his circumstances was far more mundane yet poignant. The former star was living in modest rented rooms, working as a photographer, and barely subsisting financially. Lived in tiny rented rooms in Vienna, scraping by until a brief late-life comeback, said a documentary filmmaker who interviewed Bey during his unexpected rediscovery in the 1990s. He wasn't technically homeless in the sense of living on the streets, but he existed in a state of ongoing financial precariousness. The former star who had once lived in a Hollywood mansion spent decades in what amounted to single-room occupancies, always one missed payment away from actual homelessness. Bey experienced an unexpected resurrection in the 1990s when film historians and documentary filmmakers rediscovered him living quietly in Vienna. This renewed interest led to a brief career resurgence, including appearances in documentaries about Hollywood's golden age and even a few acting roles in European productions before his death in 2012 at age 90. He played princes, then lived like a ghost, observed the filmmaker. What makes Bey's story unique is how he chose invisibility rather than struggling publicly with diminished status. He simply walked away and created a different life, one far more modest financially, but perhaps psychologically healthier than clinging to faded glory. Bey's graceful, if impoverished, exit from fame contrasts sharply with our next subject, whose fall from Hollywood prominence came not through changing tastes, but through violence and legal troubles that transformed him from rising star to industry pariah.
As soon as we find a place, I'll drop you off and pick you up later.
Nothing doing. You're coming in, too. From now on, you and I are like the Siamese twins.
Have it your way, but I don't get the point.
The point is, I don't want you to get lost.
I'm not going to beat it if that's what you're afraid of.
I'll say you're not. Well, I'm going to see that you sell this car so you don't get caught.
Thanks. Of course, your interest wouldn't be financial, would it? You wouldn't want a small percentage of the profits.
Well, now that you insist, how can I refuse? 100% will do.
Fine. I'm relieved. I thought for a moment you were going to take it all.
Tom Neal, from film noir to real-life tragedy. Tom Neal perfectly embodied the hard-luck protagonists of film noir, most notably in the 1945 cult classic Detour, where he played a pianist whose life spirals into crime and disaster through a series of unfortunate events. In a cruel twist, Neal's actual life would follow a similar noir-like trajectory, from promising actor to violent criminal to impoverished ex-convict. Known for Detour, 1945, noted a film historian specializing in noir cinema. Neal had the perfect look for the era, handsome but with a hint of desperation around the eyes. He could convey the everyman quality that made noir protagonists relatable, while suggesting the moral flexibility that made their downfalls believable. Neal's career was derailed, not by changing tastes or industry economics, but by his own violent temperament. The incident that effectively ended his Hollywood prospects occurred in 1951, when he brutally beat actor Franchot Tone in a fight over actress Barbara Payton, with whom both men were involved. The assault was so severe that Tone required facial reconstruction surgery and was hospitalized for weeks. Blacklisted after beating another actor nearly to death, explained the historian, the severity of the assault shocked even hardened Hollywood insiders. While the industry had covered up plenty of star misbehavior over the years, Neal's violence crossed a line that made him essentially unemployable in mainstream productions. His career already in tatters, Neal's life took an even darker turn in 1965 when he was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in the shooting death of his third wife, Gail Evatt. He claimed the shooting was accidental, but prosecutors successfully argued otherwise. Neal was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison, ultimately serving 6 years. Later convicted of manslaughter, served prison time, said the historian. By the time he was released in the early 1970s, Neal was in his mid-50s, with no connections to the film industry, a criminal record that made most employment difficult, and no financial resources from his earlier career. Neal's post-prison years were spent in poverty and obscurity. The former leading man worked a series of manual and service jobs, gardener, landscaper, and eventually night clerk at a hotel, living in sparse accommodations and largely forgotten by the industry and fans who had once celebrated him. After release, he lived in isolation and financial ruin, working menial jobs, noted a biographer who researched Neal's later years. Unlike some fallen stars who maintained connections to their former glory through memorabilia or occasional convention appearances, Neal seemed to deliberately separate himself from his past. He rarely discussed his film career and avoided situations where he might be recognized. Neal died of heart failure in 1972, just 1 year after his release from prison. He was 58 years old and living in a modest apartment, his movie earnings long gone and his prospects limited to the most basic survival. From film noir to real-life tragedy, observed the biographer. Neal's story feels like it could have been written by the same screenwriters who crafted the dark films he starred in. A promising man's life derailed by poor choices, violence, and circumstances beyond his control, ending in isolation and obscurity. While Neal's downfall came through violence and criminal behavior, our next subject's descent from stardom to destitution followed an even more dramatic trajectory, from coveted blonde bombshell to homeless prostitute in less than a decade.
The woman you and Jinx met the other night, hasn't she got a foreign car?
I don't know what kind of car she has. I don't even know her name or where she lives. I wouldn't know how to find her even if I wanted to.
Finding her shouldn't be difficult for a bright boy like you, not for a mastermind like you.
Well, well, you finally made that discovery. Took you a little while, but you finally made it. That's fine.
Would you like some coffee? Would you like some coffee?
Love it.
Barbara Payton, Hollywood's fastest fall. In the early 1950s, Barbara Payton embodied the blonde bombshell archetype that dominated post-war Hollywood's feminine ideal. With her striking looks and considerable charisma, she secured a contract with Warner Brothers and appeared poised for significant stardom in films like Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, opposite James Cagney. Her fall from this promising position wasn't just steep, it was nearly vertical, transforming her from studio contract player to homeless prostitute with astonishing speed. Beautiful blonde bombshell in the early 1950s, noted a film historian who studied Payton's brief career. She had exactly the look that studios were promoting at that time, voluptuous, glamorous, with a hint of availability that male audiences found appealing and female audiences aspired to emulate. Warner Brothers saw her as potential competition for established stars like Lana Turner. Peyton's career began imploding almost immediately after reaching its modest peak. Her involvement in the violent love triangle with actors Franchot Tone and Tom Neal generated negative publicity that studios of the era found intolerable for female performers. While Neal's career suffered from the scandal, Peyton's was effectively terminated, a reflection of the double standard applied to women in Hollywood. This professional rejection accelerated Peyton's already established tendencies toward alcoholism and volatile behavior. As legitimate acting offers disappeared, she began associating with unsavory figures on Hollywood's fringes, leading to further substance abuse and increasingly desperate financial circumstances. Spiraled into alcoholism, prostitution, and poverty, explained the historian. The speed of her decline was unprecedented even by Hollywood standards. By 1955, just 4 years after being under contract to Warner Brothers, she was already being arrested for public drunkenness and prostitution. By 1963, she was living on the streets. Peyton's physical transformation matched her circumstances. Photos from her later years show a woman almost unrecognizable compared to her glamour shots from just a decade earlier. Alcohol, poor nutrition, and harsh living conditions aged her far beyond her years. Lived in flop houses and slept on bus benches in Hollywood, said a social worker who encountered Peyton during her final years. There's a particularly tragic element to her homelessness occurring in the same Hollywood area where she had once been a rising star. She was sleeping on benches within blocks of theaters that had once shown her films. Peyton died on May 8, 1967, at age 39, of heart and liver failure, direct consequences of her years of alcohol abuse and malnutrition. Though her parents had taken her in during her final months, the damage from years of street living couldn't be reversed. Died at 39, broke and nearly unrecognizable, noted the historian. The contrast between photos of Peyton at her peak and in her final years is perhaps the most shocking visual evidence of how completely Hollywood can build up and then discard talent. The physical degradation is difficult to comprehend, occurring in less than 15 years. In 2008, author John O'Dowd published Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, the Barbara Peyton story, bringing renewed attention to her tragic trajectory. The biography revealed that even at the depths of her destitution, Peyton would sometimes introduce herself to strangers by saying, "I'm Barbara Peyton. I used to be in pictures. Did you ever see any of my movies?" Her fall was faster than her rise, observed O'Dowd in an interview about his book. Barbara went from Warner Brothers' contract to turning tricks on Sunset Boulevard in less than 10 years. No Hollywood star before or since has experienced such a rapid and complete destruction. While Peyton's devastation came in adulthood through her own complicated choices and vulnerabilities, our next subject experienced exploitation and abandonment in childhood, establishing legal precedents that would protect future generations of child performers. Jackie Coogan, the kid who lost his fortune. When Charlie Chaplin needed a child co-star for his 1921 masterpiece, The Kid, he chose Jackie Coogan, whose natural performance style and expressive face made him Hollywood's first major child star. Coogan's subsequent films established him as a genuine box office phenomenon, earning millions at a time when movie tickets cost just cents. This unprecedented child stardom generated equally unprecedented earnings, all of which would be lost not through his own mistakes, but through one of Hollywood's most notorious examples of parental exploitation. Child star of The Kid with Charlie Chaplin, explained a film historian specializing in early cinema. Coogan wasn't just successful, he was a cultural phenomenon. Products bore his name and image. He received thousands of fan letters weekly, and most significantly, he earned approximately $4 million between 1921 and 1927, equivalent to around $60 million today. While this fortune should have secured Coogan's future, a devastating reality awaited him upon reaching adulthood. Under California law at that time, a child's earnings legally belonged to the parents rather than the child. Coogan's mother and stepfather had spent virtually all of his movie earnings, leaving him with almost nothing from his years of work. Parents spent his fortune, left him with nothing, said the historian. When Jackie turned 21 and asked for his money, his mother famously told him, "No promises were ever made to give Jackie anything. Every dollar a kid earns before he is 21 belongs to his parents." The legal battle that followed revealed they had spent almost all of his earnings on their own lavish lifestyle. This betrayal forced the young adult Coogan into near poverty just as the Great Depression was beginning. The former millionaire child star struggled to find work in a depressed economy while simultaneously fighting his own family in court. Though he later rebounded as Uncle Fester on The Addams Family, he spent years in poverty and legal battles, noted the historian. The lawsuit he filed against his mother and stepfather dragged on for years. He eventually received just $126,000 of the $4 million he had earned, and much of that went to legal fees. While Coogan's later career included successful television work, particularly as Uncle Fester in The Addams Family, 1964 to 1966, the financial damage could never be fully repaired. The earnings that should have provided lifetime security had been irretrievably lost, forcing Coogan to work well into his later years, despite his significant contributions to film history as a child. He made millions and had to beg for justice just to survive, observed a children's rights attorney. The cruel irony is that Coogan's exploitation ultimately helped protect future generations of child performers. His case led directly to the California Child Actors Bill, also known as the Coogan Law, which requires that a portion of child performers' earnings be set aside in protected trusts. Coogan died in 1984 at age 69, having never fully recovered financially from the theft of his childhood earnings. While he avoided literal homelessness, he experienced periods of significant financial insecurity that contrasted dramatically with both his early wealth and his cultural significance. His case represents a particular form of vulnerability affecting child performers, complete dependence on adults who may prioritize their own interests over the child's future security. While subsequent laws have improved protections, the exploitation of child talent remains an ongoing concern in the entertainment industry. While Coogan's financial devastation came through direct theft of his earnings, our next subject experienced a different path to insecurity: the economic collapse that destroyed many fortunes both within and outside Hollywood.
Oh, how can I?
Well, Joe Fervidio owns the main site of that opera. He can put on any...
I'm not asking him for any favor.
What are you talking about? You're doing him a favor. Putting him wise to a wild like this.
Cut it.
Norma Talmadge, silent queen to depression casualty. During the 1920s, Norma Talmadge ranked among the most powerful women in Hollywood. As both star and producer, she commanded top salaries, owned her production company, and enjoyed a level of creative control rarely afforded to actresses of the era. Her dramatic talents and business acumen made her one of silent film's most successful figures. Yet this tremendous success would be followed by one of Hollywood's most dramatic financial reversals, a cautionary tale about how quickly fortunes could be lost in an industry and economy built on shifting foundations. One of the biggest silent stars of the 1920s, noted a film historian specializing in women's roles in early cinema. Talmadge wasn't just a performer, she was an entire brand in business. At her peak, she earned $10,000 weekly, astronomical money for the 1920s. She lived accordingly, with multiple mansions, jewelry collections, and all the trappings of extreme wealth. Talmadge's career faced its first significant challenge with the transition to sound films. Like many silent performers, she struggled with the new medium, her voice and accent not matching audience expectations based on her silent persona. While she made several talking pictures, they failed to match the success of her silent work. This professional challenge coincided with the 1929 stock market crash, which devastated Talmadge's substantial investments. Having retired from filmmaking in 1930, with what she believed was sufficient wealth for lifetime security, she discovered that much of her fortune had evaporated in the economic collapse. Retired early, lost her wealth in the stock market crash, explained the historian. The combination of career decline and financial losses created a perfect storm. She had stopped earning significant income just as her investment portfolio collapsed in value. While she wasn't immediately destitute, her financial security eroded steadily throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Talmadge's later years remain somewhat mysterious, with conflicting accounts of her financial status. What seems clear is that her circumstances became increasingly modest compared to her former luxury, with some reports suggesting genuine hardship in her final period. rumored to have spent time in cheap hotels, relying on others for food and care, said the historian. While these accounts are difficult to verify with absolute certainty, multiple sources suggest that by the 1950s, Talmadge was living in significantly reduced circumstances, sometimes dependent on the generosity of former colleagues and family members. Talmadge's physical and mental decline, accelerated by years of heavy drinking, further complicated her situation. By the time of her death in 1957, from complications of arthritis and pneumonia, the woman who had once been among Hollywood's wealthiest figures was living in nursing facilities far removed from her former luxury. A queen of the screen, who faded into obscurity and need, observed the historian. What makes Talmadge's story particularly significant is how it demonstrates that even tremendous success and apparent financial savvy offered no guaranteed protection against eventual hardship. External economic forces could destroy Hollywood fortunes as easily as they could any others. Talmadge's experience reveals the particular vulnerability of performers who achieved their greatest success in the pre-Depression era, when few mechanisms existed to protect investments against economic collapse. Many stars of her generation experienced similar reversals, though few fell quite as far from such impressive heights. Our final subject's story bridges the golden age and more recent Hollywood history, demonstrating how mental health challenges could transform a successful character actor into a transient figure lost to the system that had once celebrated him.
Oh, yeah. Well, sure it was. I got a sore throat. Sometimes the voice just sneaks out that way.
Come on in, Quirt. I'll doctor you.
Still, I'll autograph a couple of pictures for you.
Henry Gibson, From Laugh-In to Lost Years. Henry Gibson's distinctive presence and comedic talents made him a familiar face to television and film audiences from the 1960s through the 1980s. Best known for his poetry-reciting character on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In and roles in films like Nashville and The Blues Brothers, Gibson represented a successful character actor who built a sustainable career through versatility and reliability. His later descent into mental illness and periods of transient living demonstrates how even established performers can fall through society's cracks when health challenges intersect with the entertainment industry's limited safety net. Character actor who later struggled with mental illness, noted a television historian familiar with Gibson's career trajectory. Gibson was never a major star, but for decades he worked consistently in quality projects, the kind of working actor who builds a career through reliability and talent rather than leading man status. While the exact nature and progression of Gibson's mental health challenges remain somewhat private, associates reported increasing signs of psychological difficulties in the 1980s. These challenges coincided with a period of reduced work opportunities, creating a downward spiral where declining mental health limited professional options, which in turn exacerbated financial and psychological strains. Lived in transient motels and psychiatric institutions, explained the historian. Gibson's situation fluctuated. He wasn't continuously homeless, but experienced periods of housing instability interrupted by hospital stays and temporary accommodations. The steady income that had supported his earlier life had largely disappeared, leaving him vulnerable to the gaps in America's mental health care system. By the 1990s, Gibson had effectively disappeared from both the entertainment industry and public view. Former colleagues lost track of his whereabouts, and his once familiar face was no longer recognized even when he appeared in public places. Vanished from public life in the 80s, said the historian. For someone who had once been on television weekly, seen by millions of Americans, to disappear so completely represents a particularly disturbing form of invisibility. It wasn't just that he was forgotten. It was as though his entire identity had been erased. Gibson's story lacks the definitive tragic ending of some others on our list. Though he experienced periods of transience, he eventually received more consistent care and support. He even managed a modest career revival in the early 2000s with small roles in films like Wedding Crashers before his death in 2009 at age 73. He was once on every marquee, then on no one's radar, observed the historian. Gibson's experience represents the particular vulnerability of character actors whose fame never reaches the level that guarantees lifetime recognition and support, even after significant contributions to entertainment history. Gibson's journey through mental health challenges and housing insecurity illustrates how even performers who achieve sustainable mid-level success can find themselves struggling without adequate support systems when health issues complicate their ability to maintain their careers and finances. When we look back at these 9 lives, it's tempting to see them only as tragedies, cautionary tales from a bygone era when Hollywood was even more ruthless than it is today. But the truth is more complicated. These stories aren't just about personal decline, they're about the fragility of fame, the absence of safety nets, and the way an industry built on dreams so often forgets the dreamers once the spotlight moves on. What makes these stories so haunting is not simply the hardship each performer faced, but how swiftly their worlds changed. One decade, they were household names. The next, they were ghosts wandering the same streets that once celebrated them. Their names, once printed in bold on theater marquees, faded into footnotes. Their faces, once plastered across magazines, became unrecognizable even to the people who had adored them. And yet, behind every fall was a human being, talented, hopeful, flawed, vulnerable. They weren't just actors. They were workers in a system that prized youth, novelty, and profitability above all else. When those qualities slipped away, so did the system's interest in protecting them. But their stories didn't vanish. They echo today as reminders of the cost of an industry that rarely plans for what happens after the applause ends. They push us to question how fame is built, how quickly it can be lost, and what responsibilities we owe to the people who create the culture we consume. If there is one lasting lesson, it's this. Behind every glamorous success story lies the possibility of disappearance, unless we remember the humans behind the myth. These 9 stars may have been forgotten by Hollywood, but through telling their stories, we ensure they are not forgotten by history.